The first time Lieutenant Armin Kale heard the name Barrett whispered through the dust and static of the forward outpost, he thought little of it. To him, rifles were rifles no matter how big the barrel or how far they could reach. A soldier's job was to fight, not worship metal. He had seen men cradle their weapons like holy relics, whispering to them before combat as if steel and carbon fiber could grant mercy in a war that had long forgotten such things. Armin had been raised on battlefields since his teenage years, and he had grown to despise that kind of attachment. A gun was a tool, nothing more, and he had trained his eyes and trigger finger on enough bolt-action rifles and battered assault carbines to know that it was always the man behind the sight who mattered. When the young recruits spoke in hushed tones about the Barrett .50 cal, about its monstrous recoil, its thunderous crack that echoed across valleys, he only shrugged. He had survived artillery barrages that split the ground open, mortars that fell without warning, and ambushes that left men screaming for their mothers in the mud. What was one more rifle, even one large enough to pierce steel at over 2 kilometers? To him, it was just another piece of hardware, another weapon in a war that chewed through both men and machines. The desert that stretched before his unit was merciless, a wasteland of rock and dust where every ridge could hide a muzzle flash. His platoon had been tasked with securing a supply route, a thin lifeline of convoys that snaked across the barren terrain to reach forward positions. The enemy had begun striking the convoys with unnerving precision, knocking out armored trucks with single shots that came from nowhere. The brass whispered about a ghost sniper, a man who wore the desert like a cloak, who could fire once and then vanish into the horizon. Armin dismissed those rumors as campfire fear, the kind that spread among green soldiers who had never felt the sting of a bullet tear past their cheek. He had seen enough to know the truth. Most so-called ghosts bled like anyone else when you cornered them. Still, the wrecks piling along the convoy path told another story, and command had decided that Armin's unit would bait this phantom out. The Barrett arrived at their outpost in a crate the size of a coffin, stamped with serial numbers that gleamed under the harsh floodlights. 2 men struggled to lift it onto the table, and when the lid came off, the recruits gathered like children seeing treasure for the first time. The rifle was a monster, a long black beast with a barrel that seemed to stretch forever, fitted with a muzzle brake like the jaws of some prehistoric predator. Its magazine lay beside it, heavy with .50 caliber rounds as long as a man's hand. One of the corporals whistled low, his eyes wide. 3,000 meters clean, he muttered as though repeating a legend. Armin only crossed his arms and shook his head. Range means nothing if you can't see your target, he said, his voice cutting through their awe. And if you can see him, he can see you. His words went largely ignored. The Barrett's reputation was larger than reason, larger than the caution of seasoned fighters. Night fell heavy over the desert, a dome of stars watching silently as Armin's unit spread out along the ridges overlooking the convoy trail. They lay in the dust, cloaked by darkness and the muted hum of night vision goggles. The convoy rolled slowly, engines growling, headlights masked, every man inside tense. Armin lay prone with his squad, eyes scanning the endless horizon through binoculars, while 2 of the younger soldiers fussed over the Barrett on its bipod. The weapon looked alien in their hands as though it belonged in another war entirely. They adjusted the scope, chambered around, and whispered about glory shots, about what it would mean to be the one to take down the so-called ghost. Armin tuned them out. His instincts were restless. The desert had grown too quiet, the kind of silence that did not belong to nature but to intention. He felt it in his chest, in the stillness of the air, in the way even the crickets had fallen silent. The shot came like lightning without thunder, silent until its work was done. One of the convoy's lead trucks jolted violently, a hole punched clean through its armored plating. A second later, the delayed crack of the distant rifle echoed across the valley, rolling like a wave through stone. The men froze, every eye scanning the horizon. Armin's heart thudded, not in fear but in recognition. That was no ordinary shot. The distance, the timing, the precision, it all spoke of a marksman far beyond the ordinary. The recruits scrambled with the Barrett, swinging it awkwardly toward the ridgeline they thought the shot had come from. They were eager, too eager, their breathing ragged in Armin's ear as he stayed motionless, studying the angles, the faint shimmer of heat on the horizon. Then another shot rang and the second truck lurched to a halt, engine ruined. Panic rippled through the convoy. Armin's voice cut sharp, ordering calm, forcing discipline into chaos. He guided the Barrett team, telling them to sweep the ridgeline at 3,000 meters, but his gut told him something else. The enemy was not where they expected. This ghost knew how to bait eyes, how to mislead with sound bouncing across stone. Armin pressed his cheek to the dust, breathed slow, and let his mind stretch into the darkness. Then he saw it, a glint, faint and fleeting like a star winking out of place. Farther than he had imagined, perched on a plateau beyond even the trained reach of most rifles. He whispered coordinates, steady and precise, as the Barrett's scope turned. The recruits gasped at the distance, muttering disbelief. "That's over 3,000 meters, one hissed. Armin only narrowed his eyes. "Then hit him," he said. The Barrett roared, the recoil kicking dust and bone into the air as its .50 caliber round tore into the night. A half-second later, sparks flared against the plateau, and a dark figure shifted, exposed. The recruits cheered, but Armin did not. His eyes locked on the figure, who did not retreat but calmly adjusted, returned to prone and raised his weapon again. Through the distant shimmer, Armin caught the outline of a patch on the man's vest, barely visible but unmistakable once seen. A skull badge marked with numbers. It was a kill badge, one awarded only to those who had made verified strikes at impossible distances. And the number glinted beneath the moonlight, 3,200 meters. The ghost had already claimed his place in history. Armin's breath caught for the first time in years, a cold weight settling in his chest. This was no ordinary sniper. This was a predator who had already proven the Barrett meant nothing unless it was in the right hands. The ghost's badge shimmered like a curse across the plateau, and for the first time in years, Armin felt the prick of doubt slip beneath his skin. The recruits were still whispering in awe of their shot, convinced they had landed a hit, but he knew better. That man had not flinched. He had simply adjusted, as calm as if he were training on a range instead of dueling across the desert night. Armin pressed his face deeper into the dust, every sense sharpened, his mind replaying the distance, the angles, the delayed thunder of that rival rifle. Whoever lay on that plateau was no myth whispered around fires. He was flesh and blood, trained beyond the reach of ordinary soldiers, and he wore his kills like medals. The 3,200-meter badge wasn't for display. It was a warning, a silent declaration that the rules of engagement no longer applied in the way they all knew them. This was a hunter of hunters, and they had wandered into his domain. The Barrett crew fumbled to chamber another round, their eagerness bordering on desperation now that they believed they had drawn blood. Armin's hand shot out, gripping the barrel and forcing it down before the trigger could be pulled. "Stop," he hissed, his voice razor-sharp. Their eyes went wide with confusion, but Armin did not explain. He had no time to teach them what his instincts screamed. He had seen too many men die because they believed an enemy was rattled when in truth he was only drawing them in. The night swallowed sound, magnified fear, and bent reality until it twisted into a trap. That sniper had baited them with the badge, and if they fired blind again he would answer with steel. As if to prove the thought, the third shot came not at the convoy but at the ridge itself, a crack that punched dirt inches from one recruit's cheek. The young man yelped and ducked, his courage scattering like sand in the wind. The ghost had drawn a line in the earth, and they had walked straight onto it. Armin dragged the soldier back by the collar and pressed him flat against the dust, motioning for silence. The convoy below was grinding to a halt, drivers panicking, engines stalling as men leapt from the trucks to find cover. The supposed lifeline had turned into a sitting graveyard in seconds. Through his binoculars, Armin swept the plateau again. There it was, the faint shimmer, the same glint of glass. The sniper hadn't moved far at all, hadn't needed to. Confidence radiated from every action, every deliberate shot that shattered morale more than machinery. This was psychological warfare as much as ballistic. Armin breathed slowly, focusing on slowing his heartbeat, tuning out the frantic whispers of the recruits, the curses of the drivers, the chaos bleeding from every corner. In moments like this, discipline was the only shield. He ordered the Barrett crew to hold fire, to stay low, to breathe and wait. Their protest was immediate, young voices cracking under fear and pride, but he silenced them with a glare colder than the desert wind. "You don't rush a predator," he said under his breath, barely audible. "You study him. You wait for him to blink." The words seemed to anchor them, even if only slightly. Armin adjusted his own rifle, a standard-issue bolt-action with far less reach than the Barrett, but it was familiar, an extension of himself after years of combat. He knew he couldn't outshoot a man at 3,200 meters with it, but he could read the terrain, find the pattern, predict the next move. Every sniper, no matter how skilled, had to breathe, had to shift, had to relocate eventually. Patience was the battlefield no one could escape. Minutes bled into eternity as the desert night held its breath. Dust swirled in lazy eddies, the stars above indifferent witnesses. Then Armin noticed it, a change in rhythm. The ghost had fired 3 shots in calculated intervals, but now there was stillness. Not the stillness of retreat, but of someone watching, waiting to see what his prey would do. Armin's mind tightened around the realization. They weren't the hunters. They were the bait, and the sniper on that plateau was studying them with the same cold precision he had shown the convoy. Every shift in their position, every glance of metal under the moon fed him data. And sooner or later he would strike again. Armin ordered his men to scatter their profiles, to stop clustering around the Barrett like moths around a flame. They crawled reluctantly into the dust, spreading thin, their outlines harder to mark. He kept his own posture low, almost flat to the earth, moving with deliberate slowness. The convoy was unsalvageable tonight. Their mission had shifted from protection to survival. His orders were clear in his head: endure long enough to learn. Only then could they strike back. Another glint flashed from the plateau, subtle, almost imperceptible. Armin's lips pressed into a thin line. He raised his binoculars, steady hands keeping the lens fixed. There, an eye magnified by glass watching them as intently as he watched back. The next shot roared, not at the trucks, not at the recruits, but at the Barrett itself. The massive rifle jerked violently as a round slammed into its bipod, sparks and fragments spraying across the sand. The two recruits screamed and scrambled back, their so-called beast of a weapon reduced to wounded prey in seconds. The Ghost had crippled their greatest asset with a single calculated strike, leaving them exposed and humiliated. Silence fell again, but it was not empty. It was heavy, pressing down on their lungs, reminding them of who truly controlled the battlefield. Armin clenched his jaw, fury and respect tangling in his chest. This enemy was no amateur. He had just written his intent into the sand. You cannot fight me with toys. The recruits were trembling now, their earlier bravado shattered, their faith in the Barrett crumbling as quickly as the weapon itself. One turned to Armin, voice shaking. What do? We can't hit him at that range. He's playing with us. Armin's reply was steady, grounded in iron. Then we stop playing. We outthink him. Distance isn't invincibility, it's just space. And space can be crossed. His eyes flicked across the desert, searching the ridges, the shadows, every path that could bring them closer without exposing them. The Ghost had the high ground, but high ground was also isolation. If they could flank, if they could move unseen, they might turn the predator into prey. But it would take patience, discipline, and above all, silence. He gathered his men, whispering the plan in fragments, each word chosen like a round chambered. They would not fire again, not until position favored them. They would crawl inch by inch beneath the Ghost's line of sight, using the broken terrain as cover. It would be slow, agonizing work, but it was the only way. The recruits listened, eyes wide, understanding now that this was no ordinary skirmish. This was survival against a master. They obeyed because in that moment they realized Armin was the only anchor between them and death. As they began to move, pressing their bodies into the dust, Armin kept his eyes on the plateau, on that faint glint of glass. The badge still shimmered, mocking, daring them forward. And in his chest, alongside the cold fear, a spark lit, determination, sharp and burning. The Ghost had declared his mastery, but Armin had not survived years of war to be dismissed as prey. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. The desert floor became their only ally as they crawled into the earth itself, moving like shadows broken against stone. Armin led the way, his body pressed so close to the sand that he could taste its grit between his teeth, every movement calculated, deliberate, and silent. The recruits followed, shaky but obedient, their earlier bravado long stripped away by the shattering of the Barrett. Fear had tempered them into something closer to soldiers now, though Armin could hear their labored breathing, could feel the tremor of their hesitation each time the wind carried a faint echo across the valley. Above them, the plateau loomed like a throne of death, and somewhere upon it the Ghost sniper lay in silence. His eye undoubtedly fixed on the valley below, watching, waiting for another mistake to punish. Armin knew that mistakes here meant graves. He forced his mind into discipline, breathing slow, counting each movement in a rhythm as old as his career. 10 seconds to shift an elbow, another 5 to slide a knee forward. Patience was their weapon now. The convoy below had gone silent, its surviving men hugging the shadows of their disabled trucks, terrified to draw fire. Engines clicked and hissed as they cooled, smoke curling into the night sky, but none dared move. The desert had become a chessboard frozen mid-game, every piece too frightened to make the next move. Armin used that stillness to his advantage, inching his squad along a natural gully that wound toward the side of the plateau. It was treacherous ground, littered with jagged rock and fine powder that clung to their clothes, but it shielded them from a direct line of sight. Each scrape of boot against stone sounded to Armin like thunder, though he knew the night swallowed more sound than it betrayed. Still, the knowledge of being hunted pressed against his spine with every meter they gained. Somewhere above, the ghost was listening too, not with ears but with patience, with a predator's instinct honed by countless hunts. As they crawled, Armin's mind flicked back to the badge, the gleam of numbers etched into the vest. 3,200 meters. It was not merely an achievement, it was a mark of obsession, proof that this man had devoted his life to stretching the limits of human ability. Armin felt the cold respect deepen. He had never been one to idolize weapons or men, but he knew what it meant to dedicate everything to perfection. The ghost was not just skilled, he was relentless, the kind of fighter who hunted not for survival but for mastery. And mastery was dangerous because it had no fear. Armin wondered as he crawled forward, what kind of man chose to live as a shadow, claiming lives from distances most thought impossible. Was he born into this war, shaped like Armin had been, or had he chosen it willingly, drawn to the cold arithmetic of long-range death? The thought lingered, but Armin shoved it aside. Speculation was a distraction. Survival demanded focus, not philosophy. The plateau's edge grew nearer with each torturous minute, its jagged silhouette etched against the star-speckled sky. The recruits followed his lead, copying his motions, their earlier nerves giving way to something steadier. Fear had sharpened into grim determination. Armin caught glimpses of their faces in the faint light, grit smeared, eyes wide but clear now. They were learning, faster than he had expected, forced into manhood by the invisible weight pressing down on them from the heights. He signaled a halt, flattening his hand against the earth. The squad froze, hearts pounding in unison. Armin listened. The desert was never truly silent, but there was a difference between natural sound and the weight of a hunter's gaze. Tonight the silence was heavy with intent. He closed his eyes and felt it. The ghost was waiting and they were nearing the edge of his patience. Suddenly, a crack split the night, and a plume of dust erupted barely 2 meters from where Armin lay. The recruits flinched, pressing their faces into the dirt, panic surging again. Armin stayed perfectly still, heart hammering but mind steady. That shot had not been meant to kill. It was a warning, a message written in shockwaves. The ghost knew they were moving, had tracked their slow crawl despite every effort. The accuracy was chilling, 3,000 meters, and yet he had put a round so close it kissed Armin's position. The man above was toying with them, asserting dominance. Armin swallowed the rising anger and used it. He motioned for silence, gesturing them onward despite the fear clinging to their faces. The only answer to intimidation was persistence. If they stopped, they were already dead. They crawled faster now, not reckless but with urgency coiling around their muscles. The gully twisted, offering cover but also bottlenecking them, forcing their path toward a choke point beneath the plateau's face. It was a place Armin would have chosen if he were setting the trap, a place where prey funneled naturally, exposed against sheer stone. He realized it too late. Another shot rang, this time slamming into the rock above them, spraying shards like shrapnel. One recruit yelped as a sliver cut across his cheek, blood tracing down into the dust. The ghost was hurting them, narrowing their options, pushing them into a kill zone. Armin's mind raced. The plateau was not just his perch, it was his design, a hunting ground prepared by a mind that thought in distances and angles. Armin made a snap decision, veering them off the gully and into harsher ground, scrambling up a ridge where boulders provided uneven cover. The recruits followed, confused but obedient, their trust in him the only thing keeping their fear from breaking them apart. The climb was brutal, every muscle screaming as they hauled themselves up with hands and knees, rifles clattering softly against rock. Above, the plateau loomed larger, closer but also more dangerous. Each meter gained felt like a dare, like stepping deeper into the jaws of something ancient and merciless. Another shot cracked, this one further off, striking the gully they had abandoned. Armin's gamble had saved them, barely. The ghost had predicted their path, but Armin had chosen unpredictability. For the first time that night, a sliver of ground had shifted in their favor. They huddled in the shadow of a massive boulder, panting, sweat mixing with dust on their faces. The recruits looked to Armin, eyes desperate for reassurance. He gave them none. Reassurance was a lie they couldn't afford. Instead, he spoke in a low, steady tone. He's not a ghost. He's a man. And men bleed. Remember that. The words weren't comfort, but they planted steel in their spines. They nodded, clutching their rifles tighter, faces set in grim lines. The hunt was not over. The plateau waited above, the badge glinting in Armin's memory like a beacon, daring him to continue. He wiped the dust from his lips, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and prepared for the next crawl forward. The night was still long and the ghost was still watching, but Armin had felt the shift. For the first time the sniper had missed, not inaccuracy but miscalculation. That was the crack in the armor, the opening they needed. Armin's lips curled into the faintest shadow of a smile, cold and determined. The predator had underestimated his prey. And in the desert, under the endless sky, under the watch of 1,000 indifferent stars, Armin vowed that before dawn, one hunter would fall. The boulder shielded them from the plateau's line of sight, but Armin knew it was only temporary. Cover was an illusion against a man who could read terrain as though it were an open book. The ghost sniper would already be calculating, predicting where they might emerge, setting his scope upon the likeliest paths. Every second spent crouched in safety was another second that his enemy used to prepare the kill. Armin wiped sweat from his brow, the desert night chill doing nothing to ease the furnace within his chest. His men looked to him, their fear carefully leashed now, but their eyes asked the same question. How do we kill something that sees everything? Armin studied the stone, the ridges, the faint gradient of the slope. The plateau was a fortress, yes, but fortresses always had blind spots. And blind spots were where men like him lived. He motioned them to stay close and began leading them along the boulder's edge, weaving a serpentine path through shadows, never staying exposed longer than 3 breaths at a time. The climb grew harsher, jagged rocks cutting into gloves and knees as they hauled themselves upward. Dust clung to their throats, turned each swallow into a scrape of grit. Armin moved steadily, always ahead, his rifle slung tightly against his back to keep his hands free. He had done climbs like this before, though never with death lurking so close above. Every stone he touched seemed to tremble with the knowledge that one wrong sound, one dislodged pebble, could bring a .50 caliber round tearing through his skull. Still his focus never wavered. He knew if he hesitated, his men would break. And if they broke, they were already corpses. He climbed with the cold precision of necessity, every muscle coiled, every movement chosen. The recruits mimicked him, clumsy at first but gaining rhythm, their fear transforming into mechanical obedience. Halfway up the slope, a crack split the night again, and a puff of stone exploded a meter from Armin's hand. He froze, pressed flat against the cliff face, breath burning in his chest. The recruits clung to the rock, eyes wide as the echoes of the shot rolled across the valley. The ghost was not guessing. He had calculated their path again, tracing their movements as though they were already inside his scope. But something gnawed at Armin's mind. If the sniper truly wanted them dead, he wouldn't have missed. Each near strike was deliberate, not failure. He was toying with them, testing their nerve, waiting for the breaking point when panic would drive them into the open. Armin clenched his jaw. He would not give him that satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, he signaled for his men to continue, pushing forward even as the stone shuddered from another shot. Closer this time, a whisper of death meant to peel away courage. The recruits trembled, but none let go. For the first time, Armin felt a sliver of pride for them. They were learning what it meant to face true terror and keep moving. When they finally reached a narrow ledge, they collapsed into it, bodies pressed flat against the rock. From here, the plateau's lip was within reach, a jagged overhang silhouetted against the star-flecked sky. Armin risked a glance, careful and fleeting. He saw nothing but darkness, no glint of scope, no shift of movement. That was almost worse. The ghost was there, waiting, unseen but inevitable. He whispered orders, his voice a gravel scrape, instructing the recruits to stay put while he advanced. Their protests rose immediately, whispers sharp with fear and loyalty, but he silenced them with a look. "One man is harder to see than 4, he said, his voice steady as stone. They nodded reluctantly, fear anchoring them in place. Armin adjusted his rifle, checked his remaining rounds, and began the final crawl toward the lip. Every inch felt like dragging himself across a blade. The plateau's rim drew closer, jagged and merciless, each stone edge a possible silhouette that could betray him. He slowed his breathing, pressed his cheek against the cold rock, and used the rhythm of his heartbeat to guide his movements. He imagined the ghost above, his eye pressed to glass, his finger resting with patient calm on a trigger, waiting for that one flicker of motion to end him. The thought didn't freeze him, it fueled him. He had lived too long in the shadow of death to fear it now. If he was to die, it would be with his rifle in hand, his eyes unblinking, his will unbroken. Step by step, crawl by crawl, he ascended. Then, without warning, the night erupted. A shot roared, not at him but at the ledge where his men hid. Stone burst apart in a spray of shards, and the recruits scrambled against the cliff face, cursing, clutching their rifles. Armin's blood went cold as realization struck. The ghost hadn't fired at him because he had been watching the others. Armin's decision to split from them had saved his life, but it had also marked them as bait. The sniper was dragging them into panic, using their fear to force Armin's hand. He froze, every muscle taut, every instinct screaming. If he rushed to them, he'd expose himself. If he stayed, they might die. The choice tore at him like barbed wire, but he forced himself still. Emotion was death. Calculation was survival. He whispered a silent promise to his men and pushed upward, faster now, crawling like a serpent toward the plateau's crown. When his fingers finally hooked over the lip of the plateau, his chest hammered with a mix of dread and fury. He hauled himself slowly upward, body flat against the ground as his eyes crested the edge. At first he saw nothing but rock and shadow, an expanse of desert stone stretching into darkness. Then movement flickered at the corner of his vision, a shape prone against the earth, perfectly still, perfectly blended. The ghost. Even at this distance, barely 20 meters now, Armin felt the aura of precision radiating from him. The man was carved into the stone, his body an extension of rifle and earth, his face hidden beneath a veil, but the badge glimmered faintly against his chest. Armin's pulse thundered in his ears, but his hands were steady. He raised his rifle, aiming, every nerve taut with the knowledge that if the ghost turned, if that glass eye caught the shimmer of his scope, it would be over in less than a heartbeat. But the sniper didn't turn. He was still focused on the ledge below, watching Armin's men squirm beneath his pressure. Armin exhaled slowly, the sound barely a ghost in the night. His finger tightened against the trigger. This was the moment he had crawled through hell for, the culmination of every inch of blood and dust. Yet something in him hesitated. This wasn't just a duel of bullets. It was a duel of wills, of respect carved into stone. Killing him from behind, unseen, felt wrong. It would end the threat, yes, but it would also be an insult to the mastery this man embodied. Armin's heart clenched with the weight of decision. He could end it here, quietly, or he could risk everything for an honest shot, face-to-face, hunter against hunter. The badge gleamed once more, daring him. Armin's teeth grit. If this ghost wanted respect, he would have it. He shifted deliberately, the scrape of rock under his elbow louder than thunder in the silence. The ghost's head turned instantly, his scope leaving the ledge below, his gaze locking onto Armin. For a fraction of a second, the two hunters stared across the stone, eyes meeting through the shimmer of night. Then both rifles shifted, barrels rising, fingers tightening. The duel had finally begun. The mountains became harsher with every step forward, jagged ridges cutting across the skyline and valleys stretching into shadows where the sun rarely touched, and Sergeant Cole pushed his squad higher, deeper, toward a plateau that promised a clear vantage point over the enemy's staging grounds. Though every man in the unit felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at his body, the ache of muscles strained by endless climbing and the drag of heavy packs, but no one dared speak of it because they all knew the mission was beyond fatigue, it was survival itself, and in the center of this silent struggle was the Barrett, gleaming faintly in the dim light, strapped across Cole's chest like a burden and a promise, its sheer presence a reminder of what one shot could mean when distances stretched to impossible ranges. The scouts who had pushed ahead sent back word of enemy convoys moving through a distant valley, armored trucks escorted by gunmen on high ridges, the kind of mobile force that could overrun an entire village in minutes if left unchecked. And Cole realized with a cold sinking weight that this might be the moment, the long shot no one thought possible, the kind of kill that etched a name into whispered barracks legends, the sort of shot that left a man changed forever. His spotter Ramirez crouched beside him as they crawled into position, settling on the edge of a crag that overlooked the valley, and through binoculars the younger soldier whispered coordinates, ranges, wind speeds, each calculation tumbling into Cole's mind like puzzle pieces sliding into place, and though his heart thudded like a war drum, his hands were steady, trained by years of discipline, calloused by experience, calm in the face of what could become history. The convoy below appeared almost casual, vehicles spaced with precision, gunners scanning with machine-like efficiency, unaware that high above them, on a ridge they never thought reachable, a pair of shadows were locking them into a fate they couldn't escape, and Cole adjusted the Barrett with a slow, mechanical rhythm, barrel balanced on its bipod, cheek pressed to stock, his breath measured and controlled, body sinking into stillness as if he were becoming a part of the mountain itself. The distance was staggering, 3,200 meters by Ramirez's read, farther than any kill Cole had ever attempted, farther even than the stories he had mocked in training halls when old vets bragged of impossible shots taken on forgotten battlefields. And yet here he was, with the weight of men depending on him, with the lives of innocents beyond those ridges hanging in the balance, And in that moment doubt clawed at the edge of his thoughts, whispering that no human could bend steel and physics and win to his will at such a range. But he forced it down, burying hesitation under layers of instinct and repetition, because a sniper could not afford the luxury of uncertainty, not when a single heartbeat could mean the difference between victory and disaster. And Cole inhaled slowly, his mind narrowing until the world shrank to a reticle, a crosshair floating over a distant figure stepping from an armored truck, a commander by the look of his posture, the way soldiers instinctively deferred to him, the way orders cut across the wind like knives invisible to all but those who obeyed. Ramirez's voice was a low hum, calling out corrections, adjusting for the curvature of the earth, for the fickle gusts sweeping between mountains, for the density of thin air at altitude, and Cole followed them without question, tiny adjustments that to an outsider would seem meaningless, but to them were life and death incarnate, the alchemy of mathematics and intuition shaping the impossible into the inevitable. His finger tightened on the trigger, and in that suspended breathless instant the world seemed to pause, clouds drifting like statues, the earth itself holding still to witness, and when the shot broke it was not a sound but a tremor, a ripple that cracked through his bones and raced down the barrel, the .50 caliber round screaming into the void, cutting across distance as if distance itself bent out of respect for its fury. For nearly 4 seconds there was only silence, the silence of disbelief, of time stretched until it threatened to snap, and then in the valley below, the commander jerked as if pulled by invisible strings, body collapsing into the dust, a smear of red erupting across the convoy, soldiers freezing in stunned confusion, heads whipping upward though they could never hope to see their executioner perched in the heavens. Cole exhaled finally, chest hollowed by the effort of stillness, sweat stinging his eyes, and Ramirez's whisper carried the awe of a man who had seen a myth written into reality. 3200 confirmed. He breathed, voice trembling with something between fear and reverence, and Cole realized with a cold clarity that he had just crossed a threshold he never thought possible. But there was no time to savor it because chaos erupted in the valley, engines roaring, gunners firing blindly into the cliffs, rounds sparking off rocks hundreds of meters below them, the convoy unraveling into disorder, and Cole cycled the Barrett, chambering another round, his body moving on instinct, mind refusing to release the razor edge it had found, sending another shot, then another, each one thunder rolling across the valley, not every hit as perfect as the first but each one sowing terror, breaking formations, scattering the enemy until what had been a precise force became a panicked mob. The rest of the squad began their assault from the flanking ridges, rifles cracking, mortars dropping, and through it all Cole felt strangely detached, as if he were watching himself from some higher place, a man who had become an extension of a weapon, a force of inevitability rather than flesh, and when the last truck detonated in fire, smoke curling into the twilight, he lowered the Barrett with arms trembling not from fear but from the enormity of what he had done. Ramirez touched his shoulder, eyes wide, not with camaraderie but with something heavier, an unspoken recognition that men who achieved the impossible were never the same afterward, that carrying a kill from 3,200 meters etched into the soul like acid, a badge invisible yet undeniable, and Cole knew before the words were even spoken that he had just earned the respect and fear of everyone who would ever hear of it. They slipped back into the shadows as the rest of the unit mopped up resistance, their retreat silent, but inside Cole's mind there was a storm he couldn't quiet, questions about fate and power, about the price of being the man who had turned myth into fact, and though he had mocked the stories once, he understood now why the men who bore those badges always seemed distant, their eyes lost in horizons no one else could see, because once you touched a moment that shattered the limits of human reach, nothing ever looked the same again. The march down from the ridge was heavier than the climb had been, not because of gravity or fatigue, but because every step Cole took carried the weight of the shot he had fired, the invisible badge burned into him by the Barrett's thunder, and the silence of the men around him confirmed it, for though they had all fought, though the squad had struck hard and crippled an enemy column, no one spoke to him directly, their eyes flicking toward him then away as if proximity itself carried a charge they dared not touch, and Ramirez stayed closest, the only one who had truly seen the moment, though even he seemed changed, his usual chatter muted, his admiration buried beneath a quiet unease. They regrouped with the rest of the company at a temporary staging site nestled between broken cliffs, and as the fires of destroyed vehicles still smoldered on the horizon, the captain came to Cole, his expression unreadable in the dying light, and without ceremony, without the faintest attempt at congratulation, he simply handed Cole a metal pin, small, unassuming, a mark that bore no explanation yet spoke volumes, the unofficial insignia passed between those who had accomplished what most would call impossible, the 3,200-meter kill badge. Cole accepted it without words, fingers curling around it like it was both a victory and a curse, and the weight of it pressed into his palm with the heaviness of lead. That night the camp buzzed with restrained energy, men recounting the strike, some laughing with the relief of survival, others silent with thoughts they couldn't voice, but when eyes drifted to Cole, conversations faltered, voices dipped, and he became something separate, a figure defined by a single act, no longer merely a soldier among them but a reminder of what none could ever reach. He tried to force normalcy, tried to sit by the fire with Ramirez, tried to eat from the same rations, to join in the banter, but every word he spoke seemed to flatten the mood, every attempt at humor fell dead, and after a while he withdrew into the shadows, sitting alone with the Barrett across his knees, the weapon gleaming faintly as if it too knew what had been done. His thoughts spiraled into the darkness, replaying the moment again and again, not just the shot but the silence before it, the strange stillness that had wrapped around him, the way time itself had seemed to bend, and though he had hit his mark, though he had saved lives, there was a gnawing unease inside him, a whisper that asked if man was meant to reach so far, to kill across distances where the victim never even saw the face of the one who ended them, and the question lingered like an echo. He could not silence. Days later, as they moved deeper into hostile territory, Cole noticed the shift in how the enemy fought, for word had spread, whispers filtering even across enemy lines, tales of a phantom on the ridge who could kill from miles away, and the once bold patrols grew hesitant. Convoys traveled with wider spacing, gunners scanned ridges with desperation in their eyes, and though fear had always been a weapon of war, Cole found no satisfaction in it, only the strangeness of becoming a ghost story. While still breathing, Ramirez tried to cut through the silence one night as they prepared to move again, his voice hesitant as he muttered that Cole should be proud, that men would remember his name long after he was gone, but Cole only stared at the ground, unable to explain that pride was not what lived inside him, that instead it was a kind of hollowness, the awareness that in proving himself against distance he had somehow stretched too far from humanity itself. Yet there was no time to dwell because the war pressed on relentlessly, and each mission demanded more of him, every commander now pointing him toward longer ranges, higher stakes, as if once a man proved he could reach the impossible he was doomed to repeat it, and though his body obeyed, his soul recoiled with each trigger pull, the myth growing larger, the man shrinking beneath it. On the 15th day after the fabled shot, the squad was tasked with intercepting a heavily armed column advancing toward a friendly village, and the mountains once again became their ally, the ridges offering vantage points, but this time Cole found himself not on a high perch with patience and distance, but pulled into closer engagement as the enemy advanced faster than expected, and as gunfire erupted in the dusk, he was forced to swing the Barrett from mythical long-range cannon to brutal close-quarters hammer, each shot tearing through armor and flesh with horrific finality, the recoil battering his body, the noise drowning even his own thoughts. When the battle finally ended, the valley stank of burning fuel and blood, and Cole stood among his men, ears ringing, eyes burning, and the pin in his pocket suddenly felt like a brand, a reminder of what he had become, and he wondered if there was a way back, if he could ever return to being just a soldier, just a man. Ramirez clapped him on the back, forcing a grin, calling him untouchable, the legend who walked with death at his side, but Cole felt no thrill, only the quiet horror of realizing that once the world decided you were more myth than man, they would never let you be anything else. As the unit packed up to move again, Cole lingered on the ridge, staring out at the horizon where the sun bled red into the sky, and he whispered to himself words no one else would ever hear, a confession carried only by the wind, that he had not beaten distance, he had only chained himself to it, forever bound to a single impossible moment that had defined him more than all the years of discipline and loyalty before it, and though he walked back into camp as a soldier, in his heart he knew he was already something else, something no war could ever undo. The weeks bled together as the campaign pressed on, a relentless rhythm of movement, ambush, survival, and the Barrett never left Cole's side, strapped to him like an extension of his own spine, its cold metal pressing into him as though to remind him constantly that he was no longer simply a man in uniform but the bearer of something that transcended flesh and discipline, and each mission reinforced the divide growing between him and the others, for though Ramirez remained close, though the squad still trusted him with their lives, there was a distance in their eyes when they looked at him now, a silent acknowledgement that they were fighting alongside a legend and not entirely alongside a comrade. Rumors spread faster than orders in war, and soon even units that had never marched with him were whispering about the shot across 3 kilometers of empty space, the impossible reach of the Barrett in Cole's steady hands, and sometimes when fresh recruits caught sight of him they stiffened, eyes widening as though staring at a figure carved out of folklore, and Cole felt the weight of their awe as another chain around his neck, Another reminder that the man he used to be was buried beneath the myth. Missions grew riskier, each commander eager to test the edge of his reputation, sending him into positions where survival seemed unlikely, yet expecting miracles because he had delivered them once, and Cole performed as ordered, his skill unshaken, his discipline intact. But within him the hollowness deepened, a quiet gnawing sense that he was losing himself to the rifle, that each kill at distance stripped away another layer of humanity until he felt more machine than soldier, more tool than man. One night after a particularly brutal engagement in which he had disabled a convoy from nearly 2 miles out, Ramirez confronted him as they cleaned their weapons beneath the weak glow of a lantern, asking softly if he ever thought about the faces, if he ever wondered who those men had been before the bullet found them, and Cole hesitated, because the truth was he had stopped wondering, had stopped letting himself imagine the lives he erased, because to imagine was to falter, and faltering meant failing, and failing meant death for his squad. Yet in that silence Ramirez understood the answer without words, his expression tightening with something like sorrow. Days later came an order that tested not just skill but resolve. The enemy had fortified an old communications tower deep in the mountains, a vital hub coordinating supply lines, and intelligence claimed their commander, a brutal figure responsible for countless massacres, would be inspecting the site personally, and Cole was tasked with eliminating him before reinforcements could arrive, a mission with no backup, no margin for error, a mission built entirely around the legend of his reach. They hiked for days to the ridge overlooking the valley. Where the tower stood, the path treacherous, weather punishing, and by the time they reached their perch, every man in the squad bore the strain of exhaustion, but all eyes turned to Cole as though the outcome of the war itself rested on his shoulders, and he felt the pressure settle into his bones like lead. The target finally arrived, a figure stepping from an armored vehicle, surrounded by guards, moving with the arrogance of a man who believed distance and steel protected him, and Ramirez whispered the range, beyond 3,000 again though not as far as the record shot, but still a stretch most would consider suicide, and Cole set the Barrett down, the bipod biting into stone, his body sinking into the earth as though welding himself into position, and once more the world narrowed until nothing existed but the reticle, the crosshairs drifting over a man who did not even know death had already marked him. The wind shifted in maddening patterns, gusts rising then dying, forcing adjustments by the millimeter, and Cole's breathing slowed to near stillness, his heart rate lowering by force of will, and in that suspended eternity he became not man but instrument, a channel through which violence passed, and when he squeezed the trigger the mountain itself seemed to echo, the Barrett's recoil slamming into his shoulder, the round tearing through distance like a scythe of judgment. The target fell, a marionette cut free from strings, and chaos swallowed the tower, guards scattering, soldiers firing blindly into ridges they could never reach, and the squad slipped away like smoke, mission complete. Yet as they retreated Cole felt no triumph, only the deepening certainty that with every shot like this he was becoming less tethered to the world around him, less connected to the men beside him, drifting into the same myth that others whispered about in hushed tones. That night, while the squad rested in a cave high in the ridges, Ramirez broke the silence, his voice raw as he told Cole that one day he would wake up and not recognize himself, that one day the legend would consume him until there was nothing left of the soldier he had once been, and though Cole wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was still the same man, he found no words, because deep inside he feared Ramirez was right. The pin in his pocket, the small cold badge that marked the impossible shot, seemed to burn hotter with every mission, an unspoken reminder that once a man achieved the unachievable, the world would never let him return to being ordinary, and Cole realized with a heavy clarity that there might come a day when he no longer desired to return, when the myth was all that remained, and the thought both terrified and steadied him, for in war, perhaps myth was the only shield strong enough to keep a man standing. The war dragged into its final brutal months, every day a blur of smoke and fire, and though countless battles were fought, though victories and losses alike carved their scars into the land, it was always the Barrett and the man behind it who drew the weight of expectation. For wherever Cole went the whispers traveled first, soldiers speaking of the phantom marksman who could reach across mountains, who could take life from distances that seemed untouchable, and though Cole had never asked for the role, never sought the mantle of legend, it clung to him like a second skin, a part of him that no amount of discipline could shed. Commanders began to treat him less as a soldier and more as a weapon to be deployed, an asset calculated into strategies, and Cole obeyed because obedience was the core of survival, but in the quiet hours, when the gun was cleaned and the campfire burned low, he could feel how far he had drifted, how the man he had been before the shot across 3 kilometers had already vanished into shadow. Ramirez noticed it too, his friend's eyes distant, his silences longer, and he tried to keep him grounded, tried to remind him of simple things. The taste of coffee, the sound of laughter. But even Ramirez's words seemed to echo against walls that no longer existed in Cole's world. The final mission came without warning, an order thrust into their hands as winter gnawed the mountains, a desperate strike against the last stronghold of the enemy, a fortress hidden in a valley bristling with artillery, where the enemy's high command had retreated to orchestrate a final stand, and the plan depended once again on the impossible reach of a single man's rifle. Cole said nothing when the captain laid out the details, but inside he knew this would be the culmination, the moment where everything he had become would be tested beyond reason, and perhaps broken beyond repair. The climb to their vantage point was punishing, snow biting into their faces, wind howling like wolves, and by the time they reached the ledge overlooking the fortress the squad was battered. But all eyes turned to Cole with the same silent expectation that had haunted him since that first shot, and he settled into position with the Barrett as if the mountain itself demanded it. The fortress sprawled below, walls of steel and concrete, soldiers patrolling like ants, and in the center courtyard stood the figure they had come for, a general known for his brutality, a man whose orders had bled villages dry, and Cole locked the reticle on him as Ramirez whispered the data, adjusting for wind that shifted unpredictably, for snow that swirled in chaotic patterns, and for the thin mountain air that threatened to betray the round's trajectory. At over 3,000 meters again, the shot was beyond logic, beyond certainty, and as Cole steadied his breath, the world contracted into stillness, his body fading, his mind dissolving, until only the rifle remained, until only the crosshairs existed, and when he squeezed the trigger the Barrett thundered into the storm. The round flew, carving through wind and snow, time stretching into eternity, and in that endless second Cole felt as though he was no longer shooting a man but firing into fate itself, a challenge hurled across the abyss of possibility. And when the target crumpled in the courtyard below, chaos erupted, alarms blaring, soldiers scattering, artillery firing blindly into the ridges, but none of it mattered, because Cole had once again reached across the impossible and struck true. The squad withdrew under fire, scrambling across icy rocks, shells detonating around them, and though they escaped with wounds and exhaustion, the mission was declared a success, the enemy's command broken, their resistance collapsing in the days that followed, and the war finally staggered toward its bloody end. But for Cole, there was no victory in the cheers, no pride in the medals that followed, only the knowledge that he had given so much of himself to the rifle that there was little left to claim as his own. Ramirez tried to remind him that he had saved lives, that his shots had ended battles before they could devour villages, but Cole's silence grew heavier, and the pin in his pocket, the 3,200-meter kill badge, felt less like an honor and more like a shackle, a reminder of the exact moment when he had ceased to be just a man and had become something else, something both revered and feared. When the war was finally over and soldiers returned home to families, to laughter, to normal lives, Cole found himself unable to follow, for he no longer knew where home was, no longer knew how to be among people who had never stared through glass at a target 3 kilometers away, who had never carried the silence of a kill that transcended human reach. He stayed behind in the mountains for a time, wandering among ridges where the echoes of the Barrett still lingered, where the wind carried memories of impossible shots, and in those lonely nights he came to understand that the true cost of legend was not death but isolation, the quiet exile of a man who had touched the unreachable and could never return. Ramirez found him once more before leaving, pressing a hand to his shoulder, telling him he could still choose, that he didn't have to let the myth devour him, but Cole only nodded, because some truths could not be undone, and when Ramirez walked away Cole remained, the Barrett resting across his knees, the mountains spread before him like an eternal firing range. The world would remember him as the sniper who shrugged at the Barrett until the 3,200-meter badge stopped him cold, but Cole himself knew the deeper truth, that in reaching across distance, he had lost the closest things a man could hold, and though wars end, legends linger, heavy and cold as the rifle that had written his name into eternity. The end.